Today we have Thomas Paulson joining all the way from the UK, and it's nighttime over there, Thursday night, Friday morning for us. And also another note, we sometimes refer to ourselves as the HTA, being the HealthTech Activator. You're going to hear HTA throughout this presentation, but it's referring to Health Technology Assessment. So I will not refer to the HealthTech Activator as the HTA, just so you know, throughout this, HTA is Health Technology Assessment. So yeah, Thomas, I'll hand over to you to start your intro.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And good morning, New Zealand. Here in London, it's very, very cold, almost Nordic weather. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not British. I come from Sweden originally. I've worked approximately 20 years in life sciences in large multinational companies. I've spent most of my time in pharmaceuticals with AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, and now GSK. But I've also worked for medtech or IVD diagnostics for Thermo Fisher Scientific. So I have a sense of the various requirements on both sides of the very low fence that do exist within life sciences. So what do I do and what's my responsibilities? And I have been responsible in different setting, in local setting, in regional setting, in global setting, to make sure that we are managing new product introductions appropriately. And obviously, my specific responsibility is making sure that we have the right evidence base to facilitate that we are able to pass health technology assessment hurdles or bodies or whatever their requests are for evidence. And by in doing so, demonstrating relative product value. But I'm also very much involved in driving strategic evidence generation, planning, and execution, especially as it relates to non-interventional research. So our clinical operations team or our development teams, they are developing the clinical trials evidence, and my team, we are working on how can we understand what the clinical unmet needs are, what are the treatment patterns, what are the outcomes for standard of care in clinical practice, but then also try to generate clinical practice data on our products when we enter the marketplace. Before I move on, it's kind of a couple of three, not necessarily personal observations, but one of the reasons why we see this surge of health technology assessment bodies or agencies with slightly variable remit and slightly variable assessment criteria is obviously related to the sustainability or the question mark around the sustainability of healthcare provision and its funding. If countries or regions apply health technology assessment, it allows them to provide a systematic evaluation of the relative value for money of new technologies. But not all health technology assessment bodies are utilizing health economics or cost effectiveness to assess the value of new treatments. But it's very often related, the assessment of the technology is related to a guidance around market access or inclusion in public health provision, or related to the price of the product in some sense. So anyone active in this space need to think about how you are demonstrating the value of your technology. And you also need to think about how you do that in relation to what's currently available. And that is becoming increasingly more important for all new health technologies. For pharmaceuticals, it's, we've lived in that space for quite some time, but it's expanding regionally and globally. But now medical devices and IVDs are also in scope, especially high risk ones. So if we move forward, you will see some of this theme recurring.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that intro, Thomas, and we're very lucky to have you today. So I guess just to reiterate, we're here to discuss the health technology assessment and its importance for health tech companies. But on that note, could we start an overview of what health economics and technology assessment actually encompass for the viewers today?
So, health technology assessment, not activator, then is a systematic approach to summarize the medical, social, economic, and ethical aspects related to the use of a specific technology, and doing so in a systematic, and one could hope, transparent and unbiased manner. And obviously, the aim is to formulate health policies that implies that safe and effective and good value for money technologies are being implemented in the healthcare provision. So the objective is policy, but it should be rooted in a systematic and scientific approach. So some of the questions that HTA asks themselves is, okay, is there evidence enough that the technology works? Does it work for everyone, or does it only work in some specific patients or individuals? What is the cost of that? And how does it compare? And I think this is very important, right? But because as soon as we move into health technology assessment, it's always compared to something. The regulators, such as EMA, FDA, or any other competent authority, they are not too concerned about what the relative effect of something is. But health technology assessments are always asking that in relation to what is standard of care or what is currently used in clinical practice. So that's HTA. So many HTAs, but not all, are using health economics as one decision criteria. And if you're using health economics as a decision criteria, it becomes the question is this new technology cost effective? Does it provide good value for money? So health economics in general, which is more than only cost effectiveness, relates to, okay, the efficiency or effectiveness of delivery of healthcare in its various parts. It relates to value and behavior in the production and consumption of health and healthcare. So the core questions is what healthcare goods should be produced and offered to the population, and who should receive them. So that's kind of the overall, and you can imagine, you can ask a lot of, this is really kind of health economics is an area of social science, and there's people, being specialists in the insurance aspects of providing provision of health and healthcare. But the majority of the activities relates to health technology assessment are focusing about cost effectiveness. And usually when talking about cost effectiveness and to understand what that is to talk about the cost effectiveness plane. And you see in the center of the diagram or the figure here that we have a C, and that's the comparator. And then you start thinking about, okay, effectiveness and relative effectiveness and cost and relative cost compared to the current standard of care or whatever the health technology assessment body suggests should be the appropriate comparator. Where most technologies usually end up, because we are assuming that we have some sort of innovation, is in the northeast quadrant, i.e. new treatment or new technologies are quite often more costly. Well, we can talk about the price, but when we talk about cost here is that, okay, the price of something is one thing, but then does it have other implications for the cost of providing that care? So you need to think about the overall direct healthcare cost, and the introduction of this new technology, does that shift the overall budget for required to treat this patient or diagnose this patient or use or have an impact on the procedure, a specific procedure. And likewise, the question is around how is the effectiveness compared to the current comparator. And obviously, if we have innovation, we do hope that we are providing something that is more effective than the current standard of care. And usually we want to get paid for innovation, right? So sometimes the overall cost may actually increase. And one of the key questions, what do we think is good value for money? And if you see the dotted line going from southwest to northeast, that is kind of providing you with a view on what is cost effective or not. And this is different in different countries, because in the UK, NICE is willing to pay £20,000 for a quality adjusted life year. And that would be, if it is less than £20 per quality adjusted life year, then we would be south of the dotted line in the northeast quadrant. But if it is above 20,000, then okay, there's a recognition that this is more effective, but the cost associated to it is such that NICE or the NHS in the UK are not willing to pay for it. Then it's not good value for money. So it can be more costly, but as long as we get the appropriate effectiveness effect, then it may be okay. Of course, being in this southeast quadrant could also be a good thing, i.e. you introduce new technology and the overall cost, i.e. you have a cost saving for the healthcare system, and you also provide better effectiveness. That is something that health technology assessment bodies and payers and healthcare providers are hopefully embracing. But on the other hand, if you then are providing something that is more costly or with less effectiveness, then that becomes a very difficult ethical discussion. So if we are in the southwest quadrant in our analysis, are we actually willing to accept less effectiveness if we can save money? And possibly there's a trade-off there, but the ethical discussion becomes slightly more tricky to have. So I hope that kind of summarizes, what many, not all. So payback and MSAC in Australia, CADETH in Canada, ICER in the US, NICE in UK, all of the HTA bodies in the Nordics, the Benelux region, they are all looking at these things. They have different willingness to pay. So what is cost effective is a subjective thing. That's not an objective. So that is the gradient of the dotted line.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. We could spend a long time on this diagram because there's a lot you can dig into there, and we'll get into some of the variation across countries later on in the webinar. But I think the next question we have here is sort of the evidence of value is clearly required for payers and assessment agencies. But could we go into a bit more the differentiation between the requirements of regulators and those HTA agencies? And if there are those key differences, are they growing as well?
Yeah. So if we think about we can think about this as a ticket to play, right? Marketing approval, i.e. the right to market a product, comes from regulatory body or competent authority approval. So that provides you with the marketing authorization. And the focus of regulatory bodies is generally on the assessment of the benefit risk ratio. What's the benefit? What's the risk with this technology? So it's a question about understanding the efficacy, the safety, and the quality. Can we expect the same efficacy and same safety from all batches of production? Independent of this is diagnostics, drugs, or medical devices. HTA agencies, and I'll come to that later, which may be independent from Ministry of Health or the health provider or the service provider, but sometimes may be integrated within that. They are concerned about the relative efficacy and relative effectiveness. They all are independent of if they are interested in health economics as cost effectiveness as the main decision criteria. But one of the first questions they ask themselves, does this provide benefit for patients compared to current standard of care? For HTAs, we can say that in general, regardless and universally, it's a focus on the additional health benefits offered while accounting, in many cases, for budgetary constraints. So it becomes a discussion about relative efficacy and or effectiveness, depending on, efficacy from randomized clinical trials, effectiveness from clinical practice, observational data, and safety. So it's about the public health concerns and the unmet medical needs and how you address them. And obviously, at some point, also thinking, for many of them, thinking about the healthcare cost and impact. Ultimately, we have Ministry of Health, health insurance providers or service providers, depending on how local healthcare is funded and provision, there will always be some pricing and funding decisions. Some HTAs have that in their remit, some don't, but they provide a guidance, and then as a part of that, as a consequence of guidance, it triggers a negotiation with a payer or a service provider. So the pricing and funding decisions, they rely on assuming that there is the regulatory competent body review and approval of it from the efficacy, safety, and quality perspective. But since the regulatory body is generally not interested in the relative efficacy or effectiveness, it's the input from the HTA agencies on that perspective that offers the opportunity for the payer or the service provider to kind of think about, does this provide good value for money for us? So what is the value to the healthcare system, but also overall, if you have a Ministry of Health that is not only interested in the provision of healthcare, you have some countries such as the Nordics that generally take a societal perspective, and you have UK on the other hand that takes a healthcare provision, NHS perspective. So there might be different elements or different criteria coming into play. What is the public health gain, the efficacy and budget impact, and can we afford it? And that is something that I often see, right? That there is a difference between different countries' ability to afford new innovation. And affordability is quite commonly something that a lot of developing countries put on top of their agenda.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, and it's really important, the idea that marketing authorization doesn't equal, payment. I guess there have been several cases, many cases of technologies which have made it through the regulatory authorities, but not reimbursement. So I think this is great. It sets us up for digging a bit deeper into the technology assessment trends. And can you talk to the different types of technology assessment agencies you see represented today in our next bit?
Yeah. So if you move to the next slide, and I do a lot of my work in Europe, as you may understand, and that's also where we have the big concentration of HTA agencies, and that's also where we see a lot of cooperation between HTA agencies, and I will come back to that. But we do see a very, very clear division into three clear types of archetypes when it comes to HTAs. And on the one hand, we have the ones that I mentioned previously on last, those that are really only looking at the relative effectiveness of or relative efficacy of treatments. So it is the clinical added benefit, and whatever GBA in Germany decides or HAS in France decides, if they think that there is no added clinical benefit compared to what they define as the comparator, then that has a direct influence on the price that you can achieve in the marketplace. In France, if you have, so ASMR is a way to grade the relative efficacy as assessed by HAS. It's very hard, and it's a 5-grade scale. It's 1 to 5, where 1 is a significant big clinical added benefit, and 5 is no or even worse, right? But so you want a low ASMR, but when you have an ASMR or better, so 1, 2, 3, you are also required to submit a cost effectiveness analysis to HAS. So, but the majority of the ASMRs offered by HAS, it's a very tough system, is 4s and 5s. So they only offer 1 to 3s, maybe 5 to 10 times a year for all new technologies across. On the other side, but we have the cost effectiveness markets. So I mentioned it previously. We have the UK, England, NICE, SMC, Scotland, the Nordics, Benelux, Canada, Australia. They are all fairly mature cost effectiveness HTA markets. They have utilized cost effectiveness for quite some time, and have developed their own methodologies and guidelines and requirements for new firms to that the industry needs to align to when submitting their dossiers for assessment. Japan is slowly transitioning towards a system, an HTA system where you include cost effectiveness. It is evolving, and right now, potentially, medical devices and IVDs could be in scope, but in reality, it's just drugs at the moment. And they have, I will come back to that. On the other, and then in the middle, we have Italy and Spain. Yes, in some cases, we do submit cost effectiveness argumentation and models for these countries. But my feeling is that they are, in majority, driven by budgetary concerns. So it becomes the budget impact of that new technology is going to be important. But what is consistent across all of these is that the relative efficacy or effectiveness versus a comparator is the first thing that they all look at. And then they have additional criteria, which then divides them into different archetypes. And one would hope that they have the same view on the relative efficacy or effectiveness. And I will come back to that a little bit later when I talk about the trends, but we have across Europe a new regulation on HTA regulation, which requires all, so it will start with oncology in 2025. The legislation is already in place, but the full implementation starts from 2025, and it will be oncology drugs and ATMPs, advanced technology medicine products, from 25, 28 from orphan drugs, and from 2030 all new technologies, i.e. all drugs and vaccines, plus high risk IVDs and medical devices. But that assessment will be focused on the relative efficacy effectiveness perspective. And the only thing that I wanted to add here, and I think maybe I've talked about this already. So relative efficacy effectiveness, that is common in all HTA systems. It's important for you to remember that, because if you only think that you should prepare effectiveness and have that on top of your mind, remember that thinking about, okay, do I have the right documentation for my product? Do I have direct or indirect evidence of superior benefit or similar benefit, or depending on what you're going after? But that is fundamental for all HTA activity. Then they all operate slightly different and have different criteria for decision making. And in some cases, it's hard to distinguish between the pricing and funding decisions and the HTA assessment as such. It depends on the countries, but in many cases, they are one and the same. And in many cases, they are public bodies. Most cases, they are public bodies.
Great, thank you, Thomas. I think that you've mentioned the trends, and perhaps we can move towards the sort of a bit of a discussion on the overall global trends for health technology assessment across devices and pharma. And you sort of mentioned that historically it's been a bit of pharma's field, but it's been moving into a bit of devices going forward. So we'll hand over to you for that.
And I would say that Europe is leading the trend when it comes to HTA. It's always been the case, right? So we can have an argument on whether or not PBAC or CADEF or NICE was the first ones, but obviously when it comes to the presence and the importance of HTA to achieve market access, Europe has there's been a lot of HTA collaboration. There's been HTA agencies in many countries, and actually in some countries there exists more than one HTA agency. So that there's a lot of HTA activity. So we see an expansion of HTA and collaboration between HTA agencies, and that is cemented in the new European HTA regulation. It will add an additional hurdle for industry, it certainly does. But the potential upside here is that, so I talked about on the medtech side, the class 2B and 3, and for IVDs, the class D will be in scope for the European regulation. Those are also the technologies that are impacted through the medical device regulation and the new IVD regulation. And what that brings is the need to think about the evidence that you generate to support your technologies. So HTA trends as a natural consequence leads to need for more quality comparative evidence. That is increasing, and it is because it's increasing and because how the regulation, the European HTA regulation is set up, it requires us to think about, okay, what evidence can we generate in direct comparisons and what evidence do we need to generate through indirect treatment comparison methodology? So that's something to think about. But I think that an opportunity here for the medtech and diagnostic side is to think about how you can utilize real-world data and real-world evidence in supporting both regulatory and HTA decision making, especially for those technologies that are going to be classed as high risk. In pharma, we're certainly utilizing this, and we are utilizing it as a complement in regulatory decision making, as well as as complementary evidence in HTA decision making. And sometimes, I mean, when you work with new innovative technologies, sometimes it's impossible or even unethical to do a clinical trial with a comparison. And then you need to think about how you document that comparison compared to an external control arm that you need to generate the data from clinical practice. So real-world evidence generated, where you try to match the populations. We have value-based procurement coming up. I didn't put anything on impact for RX and pharma and vaccines, but I think, I mean, traditional old procurement, I see a lot of problems with value-based procurement, but it relates to the same need again, or the same trend that you need to have more differential evidence to demonstrate the value of your technologies. With respect to timelines, you know, European HTA regulations for medical device and IVDs, that happens in 2030. But for where I'm currently working, it is going to happen tomorrow. That's 2025. So in a couple of weeks, we'll be in 2023. We are currently looking very, very closely in our oncology portfolio on the products that will be subject to the new regulation. And actually, it's going to be a very interesting work, but it's also going to be extremely challenging because a lot of people is going to learn as we try to move forward.
Great, thank you, Thomas. I think then the next step for us was to dive into some country-specific examples, perhaps starting with the UK. So I'll hand over to you for that.
Yeah. I think for many countries and for many HTA agencies across the world, NICE is perceived as being the gold standard. National Institute for Clinical Excellence. They have an international reputation for analytical rigor, But what's interesting with NICE is that there's a high degree of transparency and engagement with a wide variety. We may not always like the outcome, but it's a very transparent process. It's a stepwise process where different stakeholders have the opportunity to provide their relative view. NICE evaluates medicines, medical devices, and diagnostics with a similar methodology, but recognizing that they have higher evidentiary requirements on pharmaceuticals than they have on medical devices. And when speaking to representatives, and that was why I put real world data and real world evidence as an opportunity, I was one of the reasons, because I was speaking to one senior official within NICE who said that he did see a fantastic opportunity for smaller medical device companies that are not in a financial position to document their products with randomized clinical trials, should definitely look at the opportunity to document their products in well-designed observational studies. The NICE process, and this may be a little bit fluid, is something between 30 and 50 weeks. For medical devices and diagnostics, is around 38 weeks. And it's around, okay, agreeing on the scope with NICE. Okay, what is it we're actually going to evaluate? What is the relevant comparator? And the sponsor, i.e. the company, submits a clinical and economic evidence. Then NICE commissions an external assessment center or an external review group, if you say that as well, ERG or EAC. And that's usually, but not always, an academic unit that are evaluating the evidence and provides a report, and sometimes develop their own economic model and their own economic analysis. And so basically, the AMTAC, the Medical Technologies Advisory Committee, gets a draft recommendation from the External Assessment Center, and now have, two perspectives of that same technology. Then there's a period of public consultation and a final recommendation and a resolution, and then there's a final guidance published. So the process on the right there is really around the medical device and diagnostics process, because I was thinking maybe the majority of you here are, but the pharma one looks very, very similar. If you have a positive guidance, and in this process, sometimes there is a price negotiation, and that is often there is a list price, and there may be a confidential price agreement. But what I can say is, if you have a positive guidance from NICE, that means that NHS should implement that technology. So positive guidance should mean that NHS should implement that technology widely, or follow the guidance of NICE on whatever that is. Yeah. Not all medical devices or IVDs need to go through this. So there's a kind of thinking about the benefit risk trade-off you potentially see. Virtually all pharmaceuticals go through this process, and it's required to get access to NHS. As a new medical device or an IVD, you have the opportunity to get in, but then you don't have the formal documentation that this is endorsed by NICE. And if it's not endorsed by NICE, then obviously the size of the market that you will have access to it will be slightly more challenging. Japan had been talking about implementing pharmacoeconomic evaluation of new technologies for quite some time. They ran a provisional or a kind of a pilot program between 16 and 19. And from 19, it's now implemented. It's not for all technologies. It's only for selected pharmaceutical and medical devices that has a certain impact on the overall budget impact for the provision of care. And for that reason, I don't expect that many medical devices will be in scope, actually. It's also the outcome of the cost effectiveness assessment is also having a direct impact on price. And that is unique with this system. So they actually have an algorithm to calculate the price changes as a consequence of the outcome of the cost effectiveness assessment. And that's unique, but it's also been critiqued internationally for robustness and science, or grounding in science. And as I mentioned, currently HTA is likely to be out of scope for most devices and diagnostics. So in Australia, as far and maybe you are more in tuned with Australia than I am, but my understanding is that we have two public bodies, PBAC and MSAC, where MSAC is assessing devices and diagnostics, and PBAC are assessing pharmaceuticals. And I know that the processes within MSAC has currently been under review, and there are new guidelines issued. But basically, from my perspective, when I've never submitted anything. I've been part of the team submitting pharmaceuticals under PBAC, but I've never been involved in submitting anything for MSAC in Australia. But when I look at the process, it looks fairly. So we have the scoping of PICO confirmation. The PICO is the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome. So that is the scoping. So where you agree on what is the decision problem, what should this new technology be compared with, what is the population it's relevant for, and what is the relevant outcomes that we think are of interest from a patient or a health provider perspective. My understanding also is that AMSAC runs a lot of this process, and that the marketing holder or the product holder does not necessarily have a massive role to play in this. But there is the process looks in many ways very similar to the UK NICE system, and when looking at the PBAC and MSAC process, they also do seem to have a similar structure. But I need to confess my experience with the Australian system is limited.
Great, thanks, Thomas. And I think the other country of interest to a lot of people is the United States, and the use of the standards there. We've mentioned ISA, and I think it'd be good to dive into a bit about what that is, but also the concept of, being the US being quite a complex multi-payer market with government and private, exactly. How that sort of plays out, and where they're sort of lying on the spectrum as well, I guess.
Yeah. So first of all, ISA is a play on words. In cost effectiveness analysis and health economics, ISA stands for incremental cost effectiveness ratio. That was the £20,000 per quality adjusted life year I mentioned or referenced previously. But ISA is the Institute for Clinical, I'll come back to it. It just evaded money. But in reality, there isn't any formal public body HTA in the US. You could potentially say that, you know, the Medicare Part B, Medicaid type of assessment is an HTA, but it's really not. So with it, US is really focused on FDA approval. Then obviously you need to negotiate price with certain healthcare providers and insurance policies, right? It is the Medicare and the Medicaids. It is Blue Cross Blue Shield, etc. But I think it's actually ICER's been in place for quite some time, but it's over the last 5 to 7, 8 years that ICER has expanded, and that is an independent, is not a public body, but is independently funded. Let's call it an institute that makes independent and picks technologies that they want to evaluate. The vast majority of technologies that they evaluate is pharmaceuticals, but they have been looking at some medical device and diagnostics. And increasingly, a lot of payers are looking at the outcome of these assessments. And the approach that they are applying is quite similar to that of NICE. There are some differences, absolutely, but it is a kind of a cost effectiveness driven type of HTA assessment that are being done. But the volume of technologies being assessed every single year is fairly limited. But it's interesting to see that there is an emergence of a independently funded body that are taking the lead to perform health technology assessment in the US. Having said that, I just also want to say that there is still presenting healthcare providers and payers with data on health economics or budget impact or even real world data on how patients are treated and diagnosed within their health system is still very much utilized, but it's not necessarily systemized and institutionalized as it is in many other countries. So in this figure, which I liked, is kind of, you know, provide an overview of where the various countries lie on the HTA space. So in general, US is on the left, but just keep an eye on ICER, which is very similar to UK and the Canada approach of assessing new technologies.
Great. Yeah. So, yeah, to your point, I guess ICER is a methodology and also an institute. So,
Yeah.
there was that mention. So I think we're going to talk a little bit now about, based on what we've discussed so far, what evidence should HealthTech innovators be thinking about demonstrating, you know, regardless of these different commercial markets, and what stage should they consider sort of expert advice on this?
I think if you're a medical device or a diagnostic company, I think understanding the local situation with respect to what is covered, what are the available codes for my technology, where my technology could fit in, or do I need to make sure that there are new coverage decisions made and new codes implemented, and how does money flow and how do I get paid, is going to be continue being the most important thing for medtech to kind of work out. But what I think we've also seen is that we have more regulation of device and diagnostics, especially in what is considered being high risk, and that, coupled with the expansion of HTA, need to demonstrate the clinical benefit and or benefit to the health system, need to demonstrate good value for money or ability to deliver or that the new technology delivers a lower rate of resource utilization as a consequence of the implementation of that technology. And my advice is start your evidence. If you have a high risk medical device or diagnostic, or this is definitely the case if you're doing pharmaceuticals, you need to start your evidence planning and design early, because these things take time. And seek advice with respect, if you don't have that in-house, seek advice from specialists that are used to designing and executing studies, because it's not only you think that you have great data, it needs to be passing the pressure test of both regulators and HTAs, and they have particular and fairly high expectations on the quality of evidence. So don't really brush that aside, especially if you're in that high risk space or pharmaceutical space. If you're in pharmaceuticals, it's not optional. If you're in medical device or diagnostics, you may have a runway of a few years. But if you're a company continuously developing products, you need to start thinking about this now. And if you don't have the competence in-house on how to generate high quality data and evidence that is going to meet the requirements and the expectations of both regulators and HTAs, then you're going to have a challenging value proposition. Because it all revolves around the ticket to play. Marketing approval, but then obviously that is not enough, because provision of healthcare in the majority part of the world, at least the part of the world that is able to pay for technology, is publicly funded and in many cases publicly provisioned.
Great. So we're sort of coming to time, but I think to close off, do you know of, I think we've provided some in these slides, any publicly available resources you'd recommend, a bit of a discussion around that, to stay abreast on developments in this area?
Yeah.
And any resources delving into some of the methods and frameworks?
Yeah, so obviously if you move to the next slide, so yes. I think one big piece is around the regulation, the European HTA regulation. That is going to be a big ticket item, and you can read a lot of information about that and the at the link that I provided on a homepage provided by the European Commission, but also UNETA 21, which is contracted by the Commission to develop all of the guidelines for how the regulation should be implemented and how the technology assessment will actually happen. Many of them are final, but some of them are under public consultation right now. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Then when it comes to methodology in general, I think, the first and the top and the most transparent HTA agency is NICE. It's not easy to get a positive guidance out of them, but they have a very systematic approach and they document everything, and it's a fantastic source of relevant information available on the NICE homepage. I provided a link to medical device technology, but from there you can get into the medical overall nice homepage. Which and you can go in and read specific guidance documents on specific technologies, and you will see how they resonate. And then we obviously have the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which is and not the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which is both becomes ICER. They also have a nice homepage where you can read the guidances and provide the outcomes of the health technology assessments made by them. You will see that they are probably doing some 20 to 30 technologies a year, maybe. Maybe one or two of them would be medical device or IVDs. CADETH has a nice homepage where CADETH and NICE also, I want to highlight, have, are creating frameworks for how to incorporate real world evidence into their HTA decision making. So they are thinking about that in a systematic fashion. Canada has clearly expressed that they want to utilize real world evidence in their HTA decision making, and NICE recently published a framework for what they are expecting from if they are going to make decisions based upon real world data and real world evidence, what they're expecting from that type of evidence. So that's also something that is happening. And then obviously PBAC and MSAC is, so if you want to access any of these sites, you will get a whistle-stop tour of some of the most prominent HTA agencies in the world. I didn't provide anything for HAS. Most of it is in France. There are some documentation where you can easily find your way to HAS and the GBA homepage for Germany. But yes.